Okay. Hello. Thank you all for being here. I'm Jack. I'm the editor of Phenomenal World. Very excited to be hosting this conversation and grateful to Melanie and Commonwealth for starting it a couple of months ago over email. A lot of themes that we've covered in previous Phenomenal World events, the distinction between public and private ownership, political and economic governance questions, and the relevance of these for understanding and executing on aspirations for a decarbonized economy. All of these are at the center of Brett Christopher's new book and the work of our four extremely excellent panelists we're very lucky to have with us today. We're going to get right into it, but before we begin, I'm going to try and help sell some of Brett's books. I think profitability is maybe still a necessary condition for the production of ideas. And if you haven't purchased Rob's book, Brett's book, The Price is Wrong, you can do so with a discount code here, generously given to us by publisher Versa Books. Please use and share that. The code magically and automatically appears in your cart if you add the book after clicking this link. So use that link, go to checkout, get the book at a discount. Okay, I will probably drop that link in the chat towards the end again. But for now, I'm going to introduce our panelists. MELANIE BRUSSELER is a senior researcher at Commonwealth, a research and policy organization based in the UK, where she works on the political economy of decarbonization investment, macro planning, and economic management. Kyle Chan is a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton University, whose work focuses on industrial policy and industrial organization, particularly in energy and particularly in India and China. He writes a fantastic newsletter, which you can get at high-capacity.com. Strongly recommend visiting and subscribing. And Brett Christophers is a professor at Uppsala University, the author of numerous books, including Rentier Capitalism, Our Lives and Their Portfolios, and of course, The Price is Wrong, which is the occasion of today's discussion. And finally, Robinson Meyer, executive editor and founder of Heatmap News, an energy and climate publication that, in I think just over a year, recently celebrated, of work has become completely indispensable for those of us, and obviously many people on this call who are paying attention to the details of the kinds of questions that we'll be talking about today. Rob will also be moderating this discussion, so I'm going to pass it off to him momentarily, and I will disappear, and I hope everyone enjoys the conversation, buys Brett's book, and continues talking afterwards. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. Take it away, Rob.
Thank you so much, Jack. And I should add before we start, I'm only a co-founder of Heatmap. I have great colleagues there. Also, now with that discount code, you can all tell your friends that the price is wrong is wrong. I've been really looking forward to this discussion, and not only because as it's wound up, it will be three people in blue blazers interrogating Brett about his book, blue blazers and white t-shirts. I want to start by tossing the conversation to Brett, and just for folks in the room who may be familiar with some of the arguments in the book, but maybe not all of it, I just wanted to, Brett, can you give us a brief introduction to your argument in the book, and some of the biggest ideas in play?
Sure. Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Jack, obviously for hosting this and organizing. So it's a great pleasure to be here today with the other panelists, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. So the book contains quite a lot of quite complex and convoluted analysis, but I think that the actual kind of main argument or main thesis of the book is actually, at the end of the day, pretty straightforward and pretty simple. So I think I can summarize that relatively quickly, actually. So I think the first thing to say is to make a very obvious point, which is the fact that even though renewables, and here I'm talking specifically about solar and wind power, have been growing by pretty much any measure very, very fast in recent years, at least at the global level. The fact remains that they're not growing fast enough. And obviously the key measure of that is not so much what's happening on the renewable side, but what's happening on the fossil fuel side. So as I'm sure most people are fully aware, while renewables are growing fast, the amount of electricity that's being generated from burning coal and natural gas is also still increasing year on year, which means that greenhouse gas emissions from the burning of those fossil fuels to generate electricity are also still increasing. The point being that renewables growth, fast as it is, has so far proven purely supplemental to rather than substitutive of fossil fuel-based electricity generation. So that's the first thing just to get on the table. I guess that the main argument of the book is about why that's the case. And what I try to do here is to say that what I'm not doing is saying that what you might think of as the non-economic or the political or planning system-based obstacles to faster renewables rollout are not important. So the fact that you can wait in line for many, many years to get planning permission, to get grid connections, the fact that there's large-scale obstructionism from vested interests, all of those things are important. But what the book argues is there's also some fundamental economic obstacles that still continue to stand in the way of a faster transition to renewables. And the basic argument there is that renewables, so solar and wind development, are struggling to attract sufficient private sector investment, struggling to attract that investment on large enough a scale and rapidly enough, because profitability dynamics in the sector continue to militate against it. And there are two, I guess, separate but connected components to that argument, which I try to flesh out in the book. So one of those is about the volatility of profitability in the renewable sector, the fact that electricity pricing and therefore revenues from renewables and profitability in the business of operating wind and solar farms and selling the electricity that they generate tends to be very, very volatile. And that has a chilling effect on investment, not least given the cost structure of the renewables business. So high upfront capital investment and then very, very low operating costs as the business operates over time. So the uncertain and volatile nature of profitability is one thing. The other thing, which is connected to that but separate, is the fact that not only is profitability very, very volatile, it's also on average relatively low. And of course, the profitability varies significantly across time and space. So it's very difficult to kind of identify averages. But in general, research suggests that you're looking at profits, at returns, of somewhere between kind of 5 to 8% on average over time in that business of developing wind and solar resources and selling the electricity that those facilities generate. And of course, profitability is always a relative concept. And it's probably worth pointing out here that 5 to 8%, that might sound like good returns. But if you are, for example, a BP or an Exxon or a Chevron, who have become accustomed, at least in recent years, to getting returns of 15+%, then in your traditional upstream oil and gas business, then 5 to 8% doesn't look so great. But 5 to 8% also doesn't look so great in the current macroeconomic environment. It might have looked great a few years ago when interest rates were 0 or 1%, but when interest rates are 5% and you can get 5 to 6% putting your money in the bank account or in treasuries, then 5 to 8% again doesn't look so good. So the basic argument is about profitability. And the only other thing I want to say is to really underline why that's a problem. So why is the low and volatile nature of profitability in renewables a problem? I think it's a problem for three main reasons to do with what you might describe as kind of the main global strategies for climate change mitigation. So the first of those, and these are all connected. The first of those is that electrification has been put front and center for global strategies for decarbonisation. So there are, in theory, all sorts of different ways that you could decarbonize transportation, industrial processes, buildings, heating, and all the rest of it. But the world is putting a lot of its eggs in the basket of electrification. So the idea being you electrify as much as you can, and then you generate that electricity without burning fossil fuels. And obviously what that means is that the burden or the onus on the electricity sector to decarbonize gets greater and greater as you electrify more and more things. It becomes more and more important to decarbonize electricity. So that's the first thing, electrification. The second thing is that the world seems at least to be putting a lot of its eggs in the basket of solar and wind. So what I'm not saying in the book, I don't focus in the book on solar and wind because I necessarily think that solar and wind are a better bet than nuclear, for example. So if you read Ted Nordhaus's review of my book in Foreign Policy this week, that's what he says I do. Not true. He completely misrepresents the book as it happens. What I do say, though, is that I focus on solar and wind because that's what the world is doing. That's what policymakers are doing. And yes, there's a general expectation that nuclear will play a role and that hydro will play a role. But the emphasis most places in the world is on solar and wind. And therefore, profitability in solar and wind and expected profitability in solar and wind is very, very important. Third and final point is that if the world is banking on electrification and on solar and wind, it is also banking for the most part on the private sector. So in most parts of the world, and yes, there are exceptions to one degree or another, and China, for example, would certainly be an exception to one degree or another. But in most parts of the world, what governments are doing is essentially turning to the private sector and saying, we expect you to take the lead on building out renewables assets and operating and owning those assets, rather than us governments doing it ourselves. And of course, governments play a role. They design and regulate electricity markets, and they provide various forms of subsidies and support mechanisms to try to encourage the rollout of renewables, but they're not, for the most part, doing it themselves. So if the expectation is that private sector does it, then profitability constraints are, at least as I would see it, a significant problem, given that the profit imperative is at the very, very core of private sector incentives within capitalism. So that's all I want to say by way of the core arguments. As I say, there's a lot of kind of detail and analysis underlying it, but that's the sort of headline argument of the book.
Oh, Rob, you're muted.
I was so smart. I was like, I'm going to mute myself so no little noises I make interrupt Brett's thing. And then, of course, I like come in right as he's done and step on it. Thank you so much, Brett. That's really helpful. I'm going to pose a few questions to you, but I want to encourage Melanie and Kyle to come in as you see, on cue, whenever you hear it. And then we'll go to areas kind of more directly touching your expertise. But I just want to start with a few questions about the book. But Kyle and Melanie, very much you're now part of the discussion. Don't wait for me to call on you to join in. I wanted to start by one of the ideas at the very top that you mentioned, which is that solar and wind are now the cheapest or among the cheapest forms of electricity in the world. And I want to ask, is part of what we're seeing here that they are not actually the cheapest forms of electricity in the world, that once you include the system costs, once you include, when solar and wind produce electricity versus when people want electricity, then what electricity markets are telling us is, in fact, that they're not actually the cheapest, and that they have all these costs that are kind of borne by other market actors or other system actors if you're in a non-market structure. And this whole idea of solar and wind being the cheapest is kind of more of a reaction to like 2009, 2010 argument that solar and wind, decarbonizing or switching to renewables was going to be very expensive, but that in the current context, it is a little premature, or at least what we're actually seeing in this whole kind of set of symptoms that you've identified is just that while fairly cheap or fairly inexpensive forms of electricity generation, they are not actually the cheapest. And the price signals we're getting just reflect the set of consequences or set of issues they might impose on whatever system they're built into.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and I think to a large extent that's exactly right. I mean, I'll say two things about that. So the first thing to say, I think, and I try to make this point in the book, but I do it only relatively fleetingly, but I think it's a really important point. So the first thing to say is that there is a certain rhetorical and very useful rhetorical power about those arguments about price. So as many people will know, for a long time, it was the case that it was quite easy for opponents of renewables, which is to say advocates of the fossil fuel economy, to kind of beat renewables with the cost stick. Because the cost of generating electricity from solar and wind back in the early 2000s, for example, was much, much greater, particularly in the case of solar, than from burning coal. That was kind of one of the main lines of attack from opponents. They would say, well, look, it's much more expensive. It's crazy to even think about it. And so once those costs began to come down, as the technologies improved and you had manufacturing of the technologies occurring on a larger scale, the fact that champions of renewables could kind of fight back and say, look how much the costs have come down, that was incredibly powerful as a way to kind of defang much of that opposition. And I think that's very, very important. And it's been very, very useful and powerful to kind of, as I say, kind of taking some of the bite out of that opposition. However, I think it is also true that actually, if you look at it on a kind of all-in cost basis, it's simply not true, as many people would argue, that renewables win out on cost. And without wanting to get too technical, most of the cost comparisons that you see out there, the graphs that show renewables becoming cheaper than coal and natural gas, and way cheaper than nuclear, for example, are specifically a generating cost. So they only focus on the cost of actually producing the power. And as you say, there are all sorts of other costs that need to be factored in, whether they are borne by the generating company itself or borne, as you say, by other actors within the system. So I just want to talk about one example of that, because I think it's probably the example that best illustrates what we're getting at here. And that's the delivery cost, the cost of delivering the power from where it's generated to where it's consumed. So as anyone listening will I'm sure know, when you receive your electricity bill at home, you're essentially paying for two things. You're paying for the power to be generated, but you are also paying for the upkeep and maintenance of the network infrastructures, the transmission and distribution systems through which the electricity is distributed through the grid, essentially. Now, one thing that lots of people may not be particularly aware of is that wherever you happen to look in the world, whether you look at Sweden, where I live, whether you look at the US, whether you look at Germany, China, India, the story is always the same, which is to say that renewables facilities, the wind and solar farms, are disproportionately located a long, long way from where people live. In Sweden, for example, most of the generation is far up in the north, whereas people live predominantly in the south. And there are lots of different reasons for that, but the main reason for that is simply that solar and wind farms use a lot of land. much more land than conventional power plants do. So all other things being equal, renewables developers have a very strong incentive to site their facilities as far away as possible from where the centers of demand are, which in turn means that those facilities bear a disproportionate burden on the grid compared to conventional power plants in terms of getting that electricity from where it's produced to where it's consumed. And to the extent that grid operators try to make generating companies bear the consequences of their locational decisions, then of course you may be able to generate the electricity very, very cheaply, but you have very, very high costs in terms of getting that electricity to where it's consumed. It's kind of like you can't have your cake and eat it. You can either have low generating costs and high delivery costs, or high generating costs because the land is expensive and low distribution costs. And so that's just one example among many of the fact that there are all sorts of other cost considerations that have to be factored in.
Kyle.
Do you mind if I jump in?
No, please.
This is fantastic. I'm curious, Brett, building on what you just said, how you might respond to someone who finds your argument very convincing, believes that the prices, the profitability issue is an urgent one, but would say the bigger problem though is the barriers to building. So this is related to what you're saying about the land issues, permitting, getting the right workers, especially in the American context, where it's become such a huge issue now. And I was just thinking to a talk that was recently given here by Arvind Subramanian, who is the former chief economic advisor to the Indian government. And he had this point in a book that sort of his memoir of his time in government in India. He was talking about how at that moment, he felt like the barriers to, he was talking about infrastructure and sort of manufacturing, but but I think it can apply to this case too. But he was talking about how the barriers are less so the financing and more so how to spend the money and to spend it well and how to actually get sort of projects off the ground. And so I was just thinking, to what extent do these sort of hidden barriers, these or not so hidden barriers in some cases, to building, translate into kind of like a hidden price or a hidden cost that might not show up when you're looking at the actual sort of top line number, but maybe as much a factor in preventing sort of private investment and sort of more active participation in sort of the renewable energy space. So
yeah, it's another good question. I mean, as I said, it's undoubtedly the case that there are these other obstacles. For sure, that's the case, and you only have to look at the numbers to see, for example, that the proportion of project development, of mooted project developments that apply for example, grid connection, or that inquire about grid connection, that actually end up achieving it is very, very small, and it can take a very, very long time. I just want to say, I guess I've got two thoughts on that. So the first is to say that I think it would be very, very difficult to evaluate in what proportions or with what relative weight these are problems. So I suspect that this is the case, that in certain times and spaces, the profitability and the financing is more of a constraint than the kind of the bureaucracy and the planning and NIMBYism and all the rest of it. Whereas in other times and places, it's probably reversed. What it looks like overall, I don't know. I mean, I think that's very difficult to tell. But I guess the point I want to make is that the argument I'm making in the book is that I think the problem I identify is that there is a very strong narrative out there that those types of obstacles are the only remaining significant obstacles. And I guess my argument is, look, I'm not disputing the fact that those are significant obstacles, but hang on a sec, there's also still a very, very significant set of economic obstacles that lots of people have kind of assumed away because of their investment in that price narrative. So that's the first thing I say. The second thing I'd say, and I think this is really interesting, there was a great a couple of reports I read, I think they were in the Financial Times last year, where what they found was that many of those applications for grid access and planning permission and so on that renewables developers put forward are very kind of weak and hopeful and early stage applications, which actually many of which fall by the by once the entities that are behind those applications realize the complexity of the process, but particularly the financial obstacles that exist to getting those projects off the ground in the first place. So we might hear that, say, only 5% of project applications get grid connections, but the percentage of credible and likely to be financed applications that get grid connection is going to be way, way higher than that. So, and I think that's a really, really important point, right? Which is that sometimes those metrics are a bit misleading because it's just not credible. It's just not credible applications that are there in the first place. Those are just the two thoughts, but it's a very important point.
How much is the riddle of what we've seen? Okay, one more. Actually, let me just pivot a bit, because I want to make sure we widen the lens just beyond this. But so in the book, your proposal, your solution to this is public ownership of the utility system. That's right? I feel like you might have actually skipped over this a little bit in your brief ideas, but you propose public ownership as like the fitting solution to the lack of profitability and the volatility of renewables. Is that right?
It's sort of right. I would caveat that in two quick ways. So Great. One is, as anyone who's read the book knows, I sort of skirt around the issue. It's fairly clear to anyone who reads it that that's kind of what I think, but I don't really come out and say it explicitly, partly because I haven't done the necessary thinking that Melanie for example, Melanie and her colleagues have done as to what exactly that might look like. And I didn't want to kind of say, this is the answer without really having done the thinking around it being the answer. I just haven't done it. But yes, that's where my sympathies lie. First point. Second quick point is to the extent that I think that large-scale public ownership and operation is the answer, I tend to think that only on a geographically selective basis. And all I mean by that is that while it seems to me that despite policymakers in these countries having persuaded themselves otherwise, that while in rich countries of the global north, governments doing this on a significant scale is fiscally credible, despite, as I say, despite governments thinking that it's not and arguing that it's not. It's also fairly clear that the fiscal and other constraints under which governments in poorer countries operate would mean that type of kind of big green state, if you want to call it that, is a far more challenging and even far-fetched prospect in other parts of the world, I think. And so I think that, and all of that is to say that yes, public ownership I think is a significant other option, but it's much more credible in some places than it is in others.
Melanie, I was just about to throw it to you and say, what has been the record of large publicly owned utilities in the global north? But I think you're raising your emoji hand, so I'm just going to toss it to you.
I was going to chime in on Brett's latter point about global political economy of public ownership first, but I think that's an area where I think I might disagree with you, Brett, or I'm kind of curious to probe you a little bit, because I think that there are, I'm sure many people that are listening to this call are familiar with like the problems of state-owned electricity companies worldwide and the deep imbrication with coal in a lot of countries. And I think the problem that Brett is raising around how do global South countries finance large capital expenditure programs is like a huge issue. There's like issues around dollars, access to financing, what have you. But this is kind of just like my gut instinct with this problem is that actually, to reference a previous panel with Tim Sahai and Anasar Faruqi from a few years ago, there is a difference between financing, undertaking, and funding of investment. And there can be different permutations of actors across those categories. But I think that any kind of large-scale systemic infrastructure, such as electricity, will ultimately be funded by the public, whether, like through ratepayers and what have you. And so the idea that there's a problem of getting external dollar, especially financing for Global South public utilities, would somehow be solved by having privatization and like private financing of capital, of like renewable capital expenditure in the Global South, seems to me like it will eventually reach limits around how much any given country can like macro financially fund dollar outflows in that way, in terms of like the higher cost of debt and equity for capital expenditure. And so I think that ultimately, to do the grand big green state regime, it's still a question of like, I mean, if it's private or it's public, I think you still face the need for global redistribution of wealth to achieve that capital expenditure anyway. And so it seems like I can see what you're saying with that, but I think also there's still that like looming problem in the background.
I was going to ask, sticking in the Anglosphere, I mean, this is really helpful. I guess one question I've had, and maybe we've kind of already addressed it, but I just want to like toss it out there, is that I think my understanding, at least, is that the track record of publicly owned enterprises in the utility sector doing decarbonization is like pretty good, or is okay in Europe. I mean, compared to the world. In the US, it's not very good. I think they're the worst. I think they're like the publicly owned, the rural co-ops or the publicly owned utilities are generally lagging behind the vertically integrated monopolies, and as well as the electricity markets. And I guess one of my questions was like, is this a market mechanism problem, or is this a democratic will problem? And the electricity system tends to reflect, the democratic will of the people that it's serving. And in the US, just like as a matter of politics, decarbonization isn't as popular as it is in Western Europe. And so it's actually the markets that have done pretty good, because they've decarbonized basically on a financial basis, while the monopolies and the rural co-ops and the publicly owned utilities have not done as well. Like, is this a market mechanism problem, or is this just like the markets actually compared? If you're going to, in a pro decarbonization polity, yes, do publicly owned utilities, people are going to be down with it. But in a more skeptical polity, markets are pretty good, because they're going to reveal the truth of the economics. I mean, this is a very market argument, but they're going to reveal the truth of the economics above and beyond what actual, what their constituents may actually want.
Is that so Melanie's got her hand up, so I'm gonna leave that to
Melanie, Brett, anyone who wants it.
Well, I was gonna say to your question on the US, starting off, but then going broader, Commonwealth is hoping to do research in the coming year that actually takes up the fact that you kind of have like each of the ideal types, and I don't say ideal in terms of normatively good, but the ideal types of electricity system structures, in terms of like you have everything from the TVA to wholesale markets, and obviously none are on track to hit, the concrete targets that we need. But I think that speaks to sort of like what a broader issue that I'm sure kind of Brett and Kai would agree with, is that we have in place various, investment regimes in different countries that are in development still. I think we can touch upon that later as well. But we're kind of in a moment where we're still continuing to develop this investment regime for renewables when we face really concrete targets in the near term, for many countries, is power sector decarbonization by 2030, 2035. Speaking of global north, that's a little later for some global south countries. And I think that there have been, various case studies where, because of particularities of both political economy, market developments, there has been renewables, coming online. The issue is not zero renewables versus decarbonization. It's how do we kind of continue to be building the regime that we need to deliver what we need to do in the coming decade or so. And so I think that it is interesting to look at, again, these different, how things have happened in particular places. But I do think that in my work with my colleagues at Commonwealth on the UK sector in particular, I think kind of shows an interesting case study of what the kind of like perfect state de-risking into a wholesale market looks like. So I think that's been, as Brett points out in his book, the move of many countries towards marketization, privatization. And so there's kind of momentum around this particular model of like state intervention into the market, thinking that that will drive home decarbonization. And these regimes have proven like quite fragile, I think, in the wake of inflation and interest rate increases, which we can get into. But point being, we just like don't have a good model anywhere. And I think that it's like important to be probing like what would the better model look like? Because even if we're not going to implement it on day one, there's projects ongoingly in terms of crisis management, but also kind of state making in the process that we think we need to kind of like be attentive to like what we're building as we're building the plane in midair.
What has the track record of the UK been here? My understanding is like it started out with a more de-risking approach than it had to get more interventionist to meet these targets. Is that right? Can you just like give us a brief summary?
Yeah, so the UK is quite notable in global context because it's one of the first countries to have effectively phased out coal. And so it currently is a mix of hybrid and renewables. I think it's around between 40 and 45% gas reliant currently. And it's had various subsidy regimes over time in terms of delivering utility scale renewables. And it's been predominantly dependent in the past decade or so, at least, on offshore wind development, which there's particular reasons why onshore wind has been stalled. But I think even if those restrictions were removed, it would still be quite dependent on offshore wind, which is quite capital intensive. But so it's a little bit particular compared to solar. But the regime that's been in place since the mid 2010s has been a pretty sophisticated de-risking regime called a contracts for difference scheme, which is a way of doing like reverse auctions for ex-ante fixed price PPAs that addresses the merchant price risk and revenue cannibalization risk that that Brett points out in his book. And I think that has been quite striking in terms of both delivering lower prices for the renewables that have come online, but then also like delivering a volume of renewable investment. But at the same time, even when operating as intended, it's not like there's a target year on year for how much to be building over time, especially in like a coordinated way. And then this regime hits it, it's still kind of like just kind of backstopping a general volume of investment. And then because it's dependent upon this fixed price apparatus, it's actually proven to be quite vulnerable over time because of the changing nature of like interest rates, inflation. And I think kind of demonstrates the fact that this regime of trying to take away merchant price risk actually doesn't remove investment risk or kind of risk in general. It merely redistributes it throughout the system where you now have like competition or distributional conflict between manufacturers of wind turbine parts, for example, and then the private developers themselves. And I think that stands as an interesting example, again, in global context, because it's led to like offshore wind auction failures, where last year, for example, the policy regime failed to garner any new contracts for offshore wind development, which I think one could say, oh yeah, you know, there was interest rate increases, there was inflation, strike prices should have been higher, what have you. But I think it just really goes to show that the regime that has become this like standardized, it's definitely proliferating globally, even in the US context. We don't have contracts for difference per se, but a lot of offshore wind run through states is done in a very similar fashion. And it just really is proven to be, I think, quite vulnerable. And I think that we can go on and on about what public development does that's different in terms of actually taking on risk, I think is kind of my big argument.
Brett, did you want to say something, or should I?
I will say something very, very briefly, because Melanie's been very, very fulsome in her answers there. So I think that the only thing I wanted to say is not really about the UK, but going back to the point about the US and vertical integration versus markets, and the fact that you're right that, you know, renewables have developed far faster in a kind of heavily marketized and unbundled system like Texas, for example, than in many of the parts of the states where you have these vertically integrated entities. And so the only thing I wanted to say about that is a really simple point, but I think it's quite important, which is that in my view, in theory, you could and should have the possibility, at least, to get more rapid decarbonisation under a vertically integrated model, where you have one entity that kind of can plan how the different parts of the supply chain fit together, and you can plan what's happening in generation alongside what's happening in transmission and distribution, and fit it all together in a way that's much harder when you have atomistic and autonomous actors in different parts of the supply chain, and coordination becomes much more difficult. But that's in theory. The reality, though, of course, is that these vertically integrated entities in, for example, the southeast of the US, they have huge amounts of legacy fossil fuel assets where they have enormous sunk costs. And in the absence of, strenuous regulation to kind of strand those assets, so to speak, which you just haven't had in the US, there's an inherent incentive for those vertically integrated entities to sweat the life out of those existing assets with the sunk costs. And that has militated against faster investment in renewables. So I think that there's simply the fact that the potential of that model has not been realized because of that legacy investment in those fossil fuel assets that are there. But I do think there is the potential under the vertically integrated model that is compromised where you have a very, very marketized system that you have, for example, in Texas.
It's interesting because it's also sociological. It's also, the same people who work in the oil and gas industry then go into the utility industry. It's just the same folks. And so to some degree, it's not even we're looking for like mechanistic expressions when it's just like, these are the fuels they're used to working with, and they like those fuels, and those fuels have been their career. So that's why they do it. And they know Jim, like when it comes time to build a pipeline, they know the people to call, and they're happy to do work with the people they know. It is also so funny because there's like a politics of growth and expansion here that I think is interesting, in that one thing we've seen in the US, which is a dynamic both in the markets and in the vertically integrated monopolies, and actually in the publicly owned utilities like TVA or state-owned enterprises, however you want to categorize TVA, is there's this coming load growth story. Like, US electricity demand is increasing for the first time since the aughts. And it's interesting to see how folks line up around that, because on the one hand, the gas folks are very happy about that narrative because it justifies the construction of more gas. But so are folks who are more anxious about kind of growth in the electricity system period and growth in energy demand period, or they're very worried about it, but they want to kind of talk about that narrative. And then there's a third group too, which is folks building green infrastructure, clean energy infrastructure, transmission, things that we would think of as being good for decarbonization, transmission, renewables. They're also, or batteries, geothermal, nuclear, they're very also supportive of this demand growth narrative because it's great background music for them too. And I'm just thinking around that in terms of when we talk about how the grid has, renewables have generated more and more electricity on the grid and have taken over a larger percentage of overall generation, but actual fossil generation has not gone down. You can kind of see how these two political economies conflict. Kyle, we've been talking about state-owned enterprise. Of course, the country with maybe the closest thing to a big green state that also has a big fossil fuel state and just a big state period is China. What has been I'm going to ask an impossibly vast question, but can you just talk us through the politics of some of these issues around state-owned enterprise in China? I think specifically around grid management, but also decarbonization generally.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And by the way, reading through the book, it was just impressive the amount of knowledge that Brett seems to have in his head about every part of the world, including China and India. I was nodding along as I was reading. I was like, wow, this is actually a better explanation of some of these complicated policy issues in those countries than I am used to explaining myself, at least. So kudos to that. I think, just to take a step back, I mean, also, you know, it's sort of like any discussion these days of clean energy, the green transition globally, you know, has to take into account, obviously, I think it's something like 40% of global emissions are China and India combined. So India often wants to be seen in the same bucket as China, but this is not one of the ones that you want to be seen as. Although, you know, to be clear, I think even within that, the breakdown is much heavier on the China side. And so it was great to see a lot of that in the book. And you know, also at the same time, like as high as it is, they're both making a big manufacturing push now. China more focused on, you know, ironically or not ironically, clean technology, clean industries. India too is making a big so that just means that you can already see in the data, the demand for electricity is growing rapidly, as if it weren't already. And you know, depending on, you know, which quarter you're looking at, coal is a huge part of that. So this is just all a big part of an ongoing story looking at those two countries. So there's probably too much to cover for you know, to kind of like give you the summary of of how
I know.
but I thought maybe I would point out like two maybe little lessons looking at these two countries that might be useful, thinking about sort of the role of state policy and state-owned enterprises in particular. So one is the story of China's solar industry. So, you know, stop me if you've heard this one before, but, you know, the solar manufacturing industry took off before the solar energy boom in China. So today, the numbers look the same, and you might, you know, one might be confused if you weren't sort of an observer over time. You might be a bit confused. You might think that one had caused the other. You see that China, I think, recently added more solar last year than like the U.S. in its entire history. I mean, you can always find those sort of interesting comparisons. But and you might think that that was the original driver of sort of China's solar, say, panel, module, cell manufacturing boom, but that wasn't quite the case. It actually sort of started earlier with you know, a set of changes in policy in Europe, especially in Germany, with feed-in tariffs there. So you see that boom, but the point that I want to make there is that there was a bust. There was a very painful period for the Chinese solar manufacturing industry. There was a big price war. You know, there's a lot of echoes today with the EV, electric vehicle sector. There was, you know, this thing called the global financial crisis that really tanked a lot of economies and also a lot of support for policies, including in Europe, or really sort of weakened some of that support. And at the same time, I think there were growing fears of sort of Chinese solar panels and things like that flooding the market. So the U.S. and the EU were trying to push back. In that context, in the face of sort of this very tough time in the Chinese solar industry, that's sort of when the Chinese demand side policy really ramped up. So then you see, as you know, as you talk about so eloquently in the book, Brett, you see the sort of like huge surge, not just in terms of feed-in tariffs of China's own, but also sort of low interest loans, state support of many different kinds at the central level. There was previously support at the provincial and sort of municipal level, but you see sort of a huge wave of support at the central government level. And in many ways, I would see that as a way to sort of do a counter-cyclical measure, again, sort of against prices, rather than just letting prices drop. Oops, you know, all of your solar firms are going to go under, and that's just too bad. It was seen as like a long-term sort of like imperative, as well as a short-term sort of a way to deal with a crisis. So that's sort of one lesson there from the Chinese solar case of, you know, you don't have to be a price taker necessarily in this sort of industry, or if you are, there could be consequences in terms of the survivability of your industry in the long run versus, you know, this is like, and as you point out, Brett, in the book, you know, I feel like you have a good sort of like feel for, you know, in the Chinese policy world, I feel like the closest analogy is like the Federal Reserve, where they don't de facto, they don't sort of by fiat set all bank interest rates themselves directly. They don't control the economy in that way, but they have sort of a broader social goal or mandate public mandate. And with that in mind, they sort of like are trying to use various policy instruments to kind of get there. And for China, like as you point out, Brett, in the book, the price is not so much the thing that gets fed into everyone's calculations. It is like a mechanism that can be modulated to some extent by different sort of policy tools, whether it's bank loans or subsidies. So yeah, so that's sort of one area. Yeah, should I pause there or should I go into the other example?
No, this is great. Go into the other example. I think
so-
we're all wrapped.
Well, okay, so the other example is just the role of so I tend to focus more of my work on the production side and the manufacturing side. So I'll throw out another example there. There's a lot of interesting stuff to say, obviously, about power generation itself and distribution in China, and the role of market pricing or lack thereof. But the other sort of interesting sort of point that I would throw out there is the role of state-owned enterprises in China in terms of the energy transition is a complicated one, and it's very interesting to see how they help and they hurt. And Brett, again, I think you really nail it when you sort of emphasize that in many ways, and other researchers have emphasized this too. A lot of the priorities of in China are focused more on the energy security side and sort of industrial economic growth side. So those are, so when you see it from that kind of standpoint, you see the role that the SOEs play in this. And so one example is a huge amount of China's final energy consumption is these like sort of heavy industries: steel, aluminum, plastics, and it's something like 60% of final energy use or something like that. I need to check the numbers for that. But so on the one hand, and they rely heavily on coal. So on the one hand, like to the extent that those state-owned enterprises play such a heavy role in the economy and are supported by obviously the central government and different layers of the government, to that extent, they're sort of like supporting the unfortunate carbon producing, the carbon heavy side of the ledger. But on the other hand, those inputs are going into the clean technology industry in China. The steel, the aluminum, these are feeding into electric vehicles. They're feeding into solar panels, wind turbines. And one of my favorite examples of that is steel is obviously essential for shipbuilding. So steel is sort of like, there's a whole industrial policy in China for steel. Including state-owned enterprises geared towards that. There's a whole industrial policy oriented around shipbuilding that uses the cheap steel that China produces. And then the shipbuilding supports the offshore wind installation, because you get these, I don't know if you've ever seen these photos of these ridiculously gigantic wind turbine installation vessels that are able to carry, the wind turbine blades themselves are something like over a football field in length or something like that, American football. And so, to be able, there's only so many ships that are built every year. And I think something like 90%, most recently in the past year, 90% of those types of ships are built in China. So it's just sort of interesting to see that on the one hand, you have these, high emissions, high electricity and energy intensity industries that are dominated in many ways by the state-owned enterprises. But on the other hand, they also sort of feed in and support the broader sort of clean tech world, both in terms of other SOEs and also private enterprises that are benefiting from that. So it's sort of like this like interesting mix. I mean, as with so many things in China, like just this, you get the sort of like the good and the bad. It's hard to separate them all out. They get all mixed together. Oh,
Melanie, do you have your hand up, or do you have or
Oh, yeah, but I was gonna
has it
ask.
stayed up?
I was gonna ask questions, so it's not making me saying anything. This is to Kyle and Brex. I'm genuinely curious. It's two questions. So one, we've been talking about like investment regimes, but I'm curious about some of your analysis, Brett, how that pertains to the actual operations of the electricity sector, especially as we get greater renewable penetration, and how that might also relate to the role of the state in, like both grid management in like real time, and then also fossil divestment. Like, what's the role of the state there in relation to that? But then related to that, I kind of take a lot of your argument in the book to be like there's heavy state involvement, like renewables always and everywhere. I mean, utility scale renewables are always and everywhere a state project, even when they're privately owned, I think is like a main thrust of your argument. And then a lot of your examples that demonstrate that show that what happens when you remove subsidy is investment declines. And you've expressed that you're sympathetic to the public ownership argument, but I'm curious because I think a lot of the work that Commonwealth has done is really trying to demonstrate or put forward the notion that these regimes for subsidizing or de-risking private investment ultimately will just prove insufficient. They just kind of won't be able to get enough, especially in the coordinated way. I'm curious if you would go so far as to kind of have that like functional this won't work argument, or is it still kind of normatively de-risking is like weak, not as good, but it could still go pretty far or like most of the way, even if we don't like it. So I'm curious your thoughts on those questions, and Kyle as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a conclusive answer to that question. I haven't thought enough about it. I mean, you know, in my view, you know, the contract for difference, for example, going back to the UK case, I think it's about as good as it gets, actually, in terms of a mechanism of dealing with both of the profitability problems that I talked about, both in terms of the level of profitability and the volatility. It kind of is a best in class mechanism. I think it's superior in that sense, for example, to the tax credits of the kind that the US uses, which help to subsidize, but they don't stabilize. And so there, as well as having the subsidy, you need some form of stabilization, whether that's a power purchase agreement or a hedging instrument or whatever else it might be, which is what happens principally in Texas. So if you're not going to go, this is the best answer I can give, is if you're not going to go down a large scale public ownership route, then I'm not sure what alternatives you have other than to de-risk. You know, arguably you can completely redesign electricity markets, but none of the recommendations I've seen for how that redesign might be done are problem-free. They all have their drawbacks as well as their advantages, whether that's kind of average pricing or pricing as bid or splitting the markets into a renewables model. There's problems associated with all of them. And I think contracts for difference are a pretty good mechanism. And if anything, I think, you know, if you're going to stick with them, you just need to do more of it, frankly. But they're definitely not ideal, with all of that said. So that's it's an inadequate answer to your question, but it's the best I can do. I just think I wanted to say one other thing on the China case. One thing that I found particularly interesting reading about China, I'm interested in hearing Kyle's thoughts on this. So one thing that was very clear to me was that one of the problems that China clearly faces when it comes to decarbonization of the power system seems to be the fact that it's quite balkanized in terms of the different provinces, and the fact that, as you were saying, as you were hinting at, within the different provinces, there are these very, very close links between industrial policy and economic policy and energy policy, where they all kind of fit together. And so one thing I was reading was that, you know, cumulative capacity wise, there's more than sufficient capacity out there at the moment in China if you put all the different energy sources together. But the reason you're getting so much investment, not just in renewables, but still in new coal-fired plants, is that the grid is just not managed on an even a remotely optimal basis, because the different provincial operators have their own incentives about, you know, maximizing capacity utilization within their own silos and so on. So that kind of cross-provincial management or lack of optimization seems to be a really significant issue in the Chinese energy sector in general, and electricity in particular. And I just was really interested in hearing your thoughts on that particular issue, because it seems to me to be very, very important.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it's something that you see you can see over time different sort of efforts to deal with this issue. You know, like one of the biggest ones was just in general, sort of like the big, I think it was 2002, sort of, this was the sort of big decoupling of a lot of the Chinese energy system. You know, you get the two big state grid operators, you have the big five power generators, and things like that. You have, so you and you have efforts, and then you have all sorts of other things, not just sort of like efforts to sort of introduce, if not like official sort of quasi market mechanisms like the PPAs. But you're right, the problem still remains that the incentives are very, very strong at the provincial level to prioritize, it's sort of like, what's the goal? What's China's goal versus what's the province's goal? And China's goal might be to generally want to shift the energy mix to renewables, to not now it seems to be changing a little bit perhaps with the extra coal capacity, and that's like a whole other story. But they're sort of national goals. And then the provincial goals are, how do we support our own industries? How do we make use of the power plants that we have? And how do we employ people? So funny that like, this is something, there are many lessons that might not be transferable from China to democracies, but the jobs issue is just like such a powerful sort of political issue at the Chinese provincial level. The last thing you want is for your, and so there's all sorts of sort of like local protectionism to sort of prioritize, our own jobs in our own areas, because, part of it obviously stems back from the sort of whole performance metric system in the Chinese sort of broader political economy. And I won't get into all that, but basically, the government officials themselves are incentivized, right, to hit certain numbers on GDP growth. Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
No. I was going to ask, my understanding is the political system, and I'm going to ask a question that I feel like it's one of these things that you should also correct me on, but because it's one of these things in China coverage that you often have to infer, but like the provincial political structure has a high incentive at a, let me put this in very, very broad, very bland terms. Often officials within the party structure are like directly tied fiscally to the success of local industry, right? And so like a lot of the reason this local, emphasis, especially highly polluting industries, persists is because like there's corruption. Or you've seen this. My understanding of you've seen this like historically when local officials are tried, it's often because they're tied up into these are tried by the national state. It's because they're tied up in like corrupt structures kind of at the local level with industry and politics all wrapped together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, another way I characterize it is they seem to have a personal equity stake in in some of these things. So like the broader point there is there's very, very powerful incentives at the provincial level to really sort of keep not only sort of maintain their sort of existing industry sort of mix and power mix, but to sort of like keep on sort of going in that direction. So yeah, to your point, Rob, like absolutely, that's and again, that's like it's just sort of like and that's another thing about this book, Brett. It just hits on these broader political economy issues that China's trying to grapple with. Yeah, there's you talk about India and the discoms there. So these are tough issues that are I think the energy transition sort of case of these issues is one of the most fascinating. But these are much like sort of deeper reform issues in some of these countries.
Yeah. How much of what we're seeing across all these different polities is that we're trying decarbonization is about moving to a lower profit system. And sometimes that profit is manifested as payments to equity holders in the case of investors in Exxon and BP. And sometimes that profit is manifested as localized corruption, or there's just a lot of surplus, chemical surplus, that then becomes economic surplus created by fossil fuels that allows for a lot of side payments, however those payments manifest in the economy. And then what we want to do basically when we decarbonize is move from a kind of fossil fuel based return system to, as a Q&A, as someone was asking in Q&A, more of a utility based return system where it's closer to like a 5 to 8% returns. How much of what we're describing here is just like every country has to kind of, I don't know, wrestle this transition in their own way, but what defines the transition across the board is a shift to just a lower profit energy system?
That's a big question. I mean, I think, yeah, I'm not confident enough in my view on that question to posit an answer. I think I would say possibly, but I think I think one of the things I would say is that it's also, I think, a big part of the struggle that has become increasingly clear in the last couple of years is that politicians, for very, very good reasons, have told consumers that decarbonization will not cost them. They have told consumers that you can decarbonize and that there will be no net cost to the consumer in doing that, either as a consumer or as a taxpayer, or the two combined. And the simple thing I would say there is I'm still not convinced that that's true. And I think that one thing that we're increasingly seeing struggles with, and it really happened with energy price inflation over the last 2 or 3 years in Europe in particular, but not only in Europe, is what happens when that narrative faces obstacles. And I think that I guess my worry is that politicians resort to the status quo when that gets challenged. And I think that's what we've begun to be seeing in the last few years. I mean, there was something I read on it was actually to do with China. It was the transcript of a podcast that David Roberts, who does the Volts podcast, that he did with a China expert whose work I'm sure Kyle knows, Laurie
Miller.
Yeah, and it was fantastic.
Yeah.
And he made this excellent point that in the Chinese case, but I think in general, energy policy and economic policy are not always aligned with one another. In fact, often they are directly opposed to one another. And what tends to be the case is that when they are in opposition with one another, economic policy tends to win out. And I think that's what we're going to see more of in the coming years. And I know that's not a direct answer to your question, Robinson, but I think it's partly an answer to your question.
No, it is partly because, and then I have a follow-up question, which I'm going to just say anyone in the room can take, and I would encourage anyone to take, but which is a question I've had about decarbonization for a while, which is, have we seen any country yet? I realize that's a big question, but is there a prominent example of a country out there decarbonizing in a way that was not coherent with the pre-existing goals of its political economy or regime? Because it seems like when we talk about de-risking in the US, well, sometimes US de-risking is compared negatively with Chinese state-owned enterprise-driven decarbonization. But the commonality to both of them seem to me, and you could even make the same case about Western Europe, that in both cases, de-risking a subsidy-based tax credit regime is like very coherent with a US political economy, while the Chinese supply-side driven decarbonization and national imperative driven national security, energy security driven decarbonization is like entirely coherent with its political economy. Even in Norway, which has this amazing EV policy, you can kind of understand the EV policy is like part of a long-standing goal and part of energy producers to conserve national resources. Is there a case of a country decarbonizing, excuse me, against or at least transforming its political economy by decarbonizing? Maybe China is farther along here than anyone else. But do we have like an example of this?
That's a great question.
It is a great question.
Yeah. I mean, I think that poses like fun, like probing how to think of the question, because like, there have been case studies in the power sector specifically of countries that have gone fuller on renewables, but I think that's also cases where there was far more like hydro, like, you know, Brazil, Uruguay, Costa Rica, for example, and then also the role of public ownership in that I think is quite striking. But I think kind of broadly, to marry this question with your previous question, Robinson, I do think that we're kind of at an interesting moment, again, thinking about decarbonization investment regimes and like this role of like, how does it fit into existing political economy and economic structures, is that I think that in a lot of countries or, you know, kind of regime types in general, I like this framing that Emily Grubert has on the mid-transition, which I think you can think of both in terms of like electricity systems proper, bridging from a fossil system to a renewable system, which are kind of largely incongruent to a certain extent. But then also thinking about political economic structures where what existed and kind of built and also maintained the fossil system is going to be different than what builds and maintains the renewable system, and how to be doing that in midair, I think, is the problem that we're facing everywhere, even if it looks quite different in different contexts. But also I think to address what Brett had said about this question around like Robinson's framing of is the problem like profitability, like we're moving to a low profit system. I do think that that is still a political economy question, because I think actually interestingly enough, the UK example is that part of the issue with like why there's been like stopping and stalling in terms of the contracts for difference regime is that the whole thing is premised on how do you like mitigate against merchant price risk while also having lower costs for consumers. And so I think that there have been attempts by many governments to try to address the cost concern for consumers, but while trying to like square that with the profitability concerns of developers without doing state intervention in terms of public ownership. And I think my argument would be that like over time, those things will get more and more difficult to square and should just go through public ownership, because the problem of it being a low profit system is only a problem if it's like a profit based regime as opposed to it being a public utility.
As long as it's in a I guess like that's right, as long as you don't need payments to other people to make the system work, right? But yeah.
Really quick
no,
in answer, I don't know of a case of a country that fits that has done that, Robinson, in terms of kind of going, you know, transforming its political economic fundamentals in the process of transitioning. I don't know of an example, but as you kind of hinted, China in a way will be the proof in the pudding, insofar as it has been saying for a long time now that what it is transitioning towards is, you know, national power market and the sale of electricity in kind of short-term spot markets on the model of kind of deregulated electricity sectors around the world. If it gets there, then what it will end up with, I think, is something very, very different from where it currently is at. But the big question is whether it will actually happen. It's been talked about, as far as I can tell, for a long, long time now. And yes, there have been, you know, provincial level experiments with spot markets, but they seem to me right now to still be at the level of those provincial level experiments. And I'm personally, I'm skeptical as to whether it will ever get beyond that level in terms of kind of transitioning towards the types of spot markets that you see in most European countries, for example. But Kyle might have a better view on that than me. But that seems to me could be the example that you're looking for.
Yeah, I'd actually just add something from your book, Brett, because I think it's very interesting, even in the case where you know, you point this out. So more recently, around 2021, 2022, the sort of explicit central government subsidies to solar and wind in China have kind of gone away. And the goal was to get to this point, like the analogy is always about like a kid learning to walk, and once the kid can walk, then you don't need to help. But even though the sort of explicit central government support has gone away, and a lot of this too is a lot of signaling, right? Because a lot of the signaling is to the private players and to the state-owned enterprises, like, hey, we're not going to help you anymore. You actually need to get your act together, be productive, be efficient. Okay, so you get all this signaling, but the reality, as you point out in the book itself, is that there's still all this support. It doesn't show up as clearly. It might be a bit more selective. It might be at the provincial level rather than at the central government level, or it might be sort of like through back channels, through say state banks. So it might not be as visible, but it would be a mistake to say that China sort of like kicked away the ladder and for some of these things, and great, now we're sort of home free and sort of just riding the market mechanism now to a zero carbon world. So it's like, basically, to your point, I see that even in the Chinese case, even though they've taken so long and they've been talking so long about shifting to a more sort of market-driven model for the electricity sector, even once they claim victory and put up that mission accomplished banner, it might be like that other mission accomplished banner where it's like, well, there's actually still sort of a lot of other stuff happening in the background. So.
There's another thing, a Chinese case that I wanted to ask about, which is kind of like the Say's law of overcapacity, where I think one thing that often gets overlooked in China is very oddly, partially because their growth is so export driven, is the size of the domestic market. And it seems like one thing that happens, and this is kind of what it seems like you were describing with solar, is like once the source of external demand goes away, or it's funny because in the renewable, like the long history of renewable electricity, there's like all these teleconnections where it's California demand for wind that like drives the Danish wind energy, the wind manufacturing system. It's German and broader European and American demand for solar that drives, my understanding at least, is the Chinese manufacturing complex, at least during a period of high growth. But then once that runs out, China's kind of able to unleash the size of its domestic consumptive economy toward continuing to support that sector. I just wonder how, more broadly, like, it seems like one theory of I guess maybe that fits in with this mid-transition frame. It has ties to American policy where the Biden administration is trying to establish domestic solar and EV production, but maybe not in the same way as China went about doing it. I just wonder, like, we've talked a lot of the book's arguments is about generation, but how it seems like having a high manufacturing component of solar and wind and now batteries changes the generation mix a lot.
Yeah,
maybe that's a observation. It's not really a question.
Yeah. No, this is a really interesting point because I think a lot about what this could say for, say, the US case, where you're not going to have like that kind of like sort of more statist approach necessarily, or at least there's sort of a political disagreement about the degree to which that would be wanted. But in general, the broader lesson of what parts of this whole process you would be focusing on, to what extent is it really prioritizing the demand side, consumer subsidies, things like that, whether it's prioritizing the production side, whether it's the demand side, that's sort of like the turbocharging factor for the production side. Does it matter to whether, it matters, whether the US, for example, becomes a leading producer of, say, a lot of the clean industry products, solar panels, wind turbines, things like that. To the electric vehicles is obviously the headline one now. To what extent, like, the US wants to do that, like how much is that tied to the job side versus to sort of like the broader transition goals? So it's just yeah, it's sort of an interesting question. Like where do you want to intervene in all this, or where do you think it would be most useful? And can you sort of more selectively intervene in some areas? Can you do like a big demand push? And that can pull every single other part of the sort of supply chain or whatever into in the policy direction you want, or is it going to have to be sort of more like up and down the whole sort of span? You know, that's I answer your question with another question, Rob.
To my shock, we have almost used up the allotted time, so I want to go to Brett for one last question. I know, which is the book is. But if we have time, other people can join in. But let's just go to Brett. The book really focuses on the electricity sector. And its arguments are, in fact, kind of unusual for, I think, arguments about climate change and capitalism, as much about market mechanisms and the raw function of renewable electricity as they are a more class-based account of decarbonization. And they're very specifically focused on the mechanisms of the electricity markets, as you've talked about. Given your prudent focus on the book, do you see other parts of the electricity, of the energy system or the decarbonization challenge that is subject to the same mechanisms? And how much do you think the book's arguments, which again is very focused on mechanisms in the electricity market, generalizes? Because I think a lot of people will take it as generalizing, but how much do you see it as generalizing to other aspects of the decarbonization challenge?
I haven't given that question much thought. I suspect that some of it, maybe even a lot of it is not generalizable. And I certainly wouldn't want to suggest that it is because I can't vouch for that. However, I guess what is generalizable, I think, is not so much the specifics of the argument, but the basis on which that argument is made. And what I mean by that, right, is that if we continue to live in a world in which the energy transition, climate mitigation more generally, is something that governments are expecting the private sector to take the lead on, and I think that that's broadly true. I think that is where we're at for the most part, whether you're talking about electricity, or you're talking about steel, or you're talking about cement or aviation or whatever else it might be. I think it's fairly clearly the case that government's position for the most part around the world is it's over to you, the private sector. It's up to financial markets to discipline actors in the right direction through things like the cost of capital and so on and so forth. Then insofar that that's true, then I think that the core arguments in there about profitability and profit expectations as being hugely important drivers of what doesn't happen, not least in terms of the potential to raise capital to do those sorts of things, then that's all generalizable. But the specific arguments about mechanistics, you know, I wouldn't say one way or another, but I definitely think that the general argument is generalizable, given that that's the political economic approach that remains dominant to climate mitigation worldwide. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. It does. Kyle, Melanie, any last thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to jump in because I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, Rob, listening to another podcast interview that you did recently on your podcast with Ashkat Rathi, where you both were invoking the frame green mixed economy, which made me think we need to really sort out the green mixed economy, because I think the idea that it's just state intervention is probably not a sufficient articulation or definition there, which is not on you. I think it's a collective project for us to do that. But I think to kind of jump off on that point, I think that what Brett's book really highlights is the fact that there's like a really like nodal or linchpin thing that needs to be done that we're relying on the private actor to do when it's insufficient for performing that action. And I think that that's important to think about in terms of like a broader productive apparatus or production network. So even just thinking about the way that the renewables investment regime in terms of like developing the infrastructure relates to then the like production supply chain of that. I think that a lot of the de-risking techniques that come to the fore in Brett's book have actually like eroded, or it's like really weak connections on that point. Like even I think Brett points this out really well in the book, that the technological cost declines that we have seen in the sector are not enjoyed by either the developer or to a certain extent the like turbine manufacturers themselves. And so what actually would be the ownership and investment arrangement that would allow some actor to benefit from technological costs? And thinking about like what I think actually this might address Winston Yao's question in the chat, in the Q&A as well. I think that there are different types of like public options, public ownership forms, or public direct investment forms that are just structurally necessary to allow there to be some actor in the chain that faces then investment smoothing or profitability on their terms. And I think that, so I think it's an agreement with Brett's frame that the profitability issue and the reliance on private actors is like a structural issue elsewhere in the decarbonization problem. But I think that it's actually, to my view, a really strong argument for public ownership or public direct investment, that what that's actually doing is de-risking investment systemically throughout the transition, is my little cheeky argument there.
That's excellent. Kyle, 30 seconds if you want to say anything.
Oh, I would just say the book is fantastic. Everyone should just read it.
Yes. Remember, the discount code is in the chat. We're going to have to leave it there. But please, yes, go buy The Price is Wrong. And remember that there's a discount code. So the price on Verso that you see of The Price is Wrong is itself wrong when you have the discount code. Thank you to Brett, Kyle, and Melanie for a really great discussion. This is so much fun. Thank you all to watching, and thank you to Jack, and thank you to Phenomenal World for hosting and just making this event possible. I had a really great time. I really, really enjoyed it, and thank you so much.
This was
Thanks,
super
everybody.
fun. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks for de-risking Brett's book.
Thanks so much, Rob. You did a great job.